Hello, everyone. Just wanted to give you some feedback on lesson four, which was social and environmental justice. Seems like a lot of you really enjoyed learning about these topics, so that's really, I'm happy to read that. I think this is something that's finally become a little more prominent and accepted at a wider scale than it used to be. Social justice used to be kind of one of those like lefty buzzwords, so to speak, that was really people were critical of, and certainly there are people that are still critical of it. But I think that it has become a little more widely recognized as a real problem that must be addressed. So I'm glad that many of you sort of took to the concept, and it seemed like everyone had a pretty good sense. I really want to be clear on with social and environmental justice the key aspect is that in terms of social justice, everyone deserves equal economic, political, and social rights and opportunities. Remember, that's our definition: equal social, economical, and political rights and opportunities. So remember that rights and opportunities is really key here. I know I made this clear, but I just want to reiterate. The assumption here is not that everyone should have the same amount of money or have the same size house or the same car. Like, this is not communism, it's not socialism. This is people should have the opportunity to achieve those things if at all possible. Um, and so having things like universally available good education, universally available pre-K that's not, if you know anybody or if you yourself have any children and you're looking for childcare, it's incredibly expensive. Um, and so how are low-income folks supposed to afford that? And if they can't afford childcare, then that means they can't go to work or they can't take certain jobs, or like their kid, if they get sick, like what are they going to do, etc. If they don't have like paid leave is another aspect of this. So if they don't have mandatory paid leave, which we're the only industrialized country in the world that doesn't have mandatory paid leave, that doesn't have mandatory paid family leave, um, if you don't have those things, then you're not creating a socially just society because people that have certain jobs and have certain levels of income, and most of them were, or many of them, let's say, we'll just say many of them were born with that advantage. So a lot of these, the lack of opportunity has nothing to do with character. It has nothing to do with who the people are or how hard they work. It's which family were you born into? Which country were you born in? Which zip code were you born in? Um, and I want to be clear that these are not absolutes. I never speak in absolutes. So there are certainly really lazy, low-income people out there. Um, I personally know lazy, wealthy people, right? So whether or not you work hard doesn't necessarily mean that you sort of can be successful. All else being equal, someone that works harder is more likely to be successful. But if you look at statistic after statistic, it shows that you're just less likely to move out of the lower income scales in certain countries. So the United States, unfortunately, we have one of the least socially and economically mobile societies, and you can look at all kinds of data out there. It's just hard to break out of poverty in the United States. And a lot of that has to do with a lack of social justice, lack of universally available, really good public education. Like healthcare, obviously, is a really big issue that many of you are probably extra sensitive to being in the nursing field. And so the idea is that everyone should have access to those things. Now, whether or not they take advantage of them, there's certainly room for that. So if you have access to good healthcare and you don't take care of yourself, there's only so much you can do. But at least you should have access to healthcare. And the idea is that everyone should have those opportunities. And if you encounter a situation or a description or a video or whatever in which people are disproportionately impacted because of their social status, their economic status, their socioeconomic status, their race, their religion, whatever the case may be, um, in order for it to be a social injustice, it has to be because they have some characteristic that allows people to sort of take advantage of them. So it disempowers them in some way just because of sort of who they are, the situation that they're in. So if, for example, in that example with Coca-Cola in India, it's really important to mention that the reason that's a social justice issue is because Coca-Cola is given special treatment because they're a big corporation, and so they're allowed to sort of take more than their fair share of the resources, in this case water, because they have so much influence. So that's why it's a social injustice, because they're treated differently than the other folks in the country, certainly the poor farmers in the area. Okay, so that's the important aspect, or that's what makes something a social or environmental injustice, is that these impacts are unequally distributed, and that they take advantage of marginalized people. One of you had a really good answer. I just wanted to read this because I thought it was great. It said, because of the long-term effects on health and unclean environment, this is for the Camden cement plant. Because of the long-term effects on health and unclean environment, the people of that community are not provided an equal quality of life, certainly not compared to the people who are in political power who made the decision to build the cement plant. This is an example of environmental justice problem because the environmental benefits and damages, pollution and proximity to the dirty factories, are not evenly distributed despite race, income, or social status. The community is composed of predominantly black people, and the plant among them other harmful facilities are coincidentally located there. And so the point here is that these environmental problems are unequally distributed, right? So in the Camden example, the decision to put the plant there was really made by people outside of the community. And this is, you could take unfortunately, any number of cities or towns across the world, and you'd find very similar things where people that have very little power, whatever that social status that results in them being less powerful, whether it's money or race or class or whatever, they end up with these environmental bads and then generally have less control over the environmental goods. So like less access to clean air and clean water, clean soil, that sort of thing. Okay. Um, and it gets really tricky when you start talking about and trying to disentangle race and socioeconomic status. Um, it's hard to do it, first of all, because they're so entangled. And there's a lot of reasons that race is all mixed up with poverty. Um, there's all kinds of information out there on this. I think if you're interested in this topic, a really good place to start would be to research the practice of redlining, which some of you may have heard of. Um, so you know, I always hesitate to point to race because it's hard to sort of isolate that as a factor. We certainly know that there are racist people out there, and we certainly know that there's this sort of underlying undercurrent of racism in a lot of aspects of society, whether it's just the perception of people of color and their propensity to commit crimes, and you take there's research that shows that uh, you take multiple people that apply for the same job with the same credentials, same everything, education, background, everything. They actually have run experiments on this, and that the people with more quote unquote black sounding names are less likely to get job offers. I mean, so the racism is there, whether it's subtle or blatant, as we've seen in some marches and demonstrations in the recent past. It's there, but it's hard. I don't want to be that person that points to race for everything because I don't think it is the cause of everything. I don't, it's certainly economic status is a huge part of it. But that said, race has especially played a historical role in the lack of wealth for especially black Americans, people of color in general. So if you look up redlining, this was an actual policy from the U.S. federal government in the mid 20th century to offer higher. Um, it was more expensive, basically, like higher interest rates to buy a house in these areas that were literally drawn with a red line around them in mostly urban areas, and they were highly, a lot of high population of black and other people of color, and it was very deliberate, so surprisingly deliberate that it was like based on race. And so the problem is that yes, there's no redlining today technically, but those red lines might as well be there in a lot of major cities because you end up with these really low income areas where only mostly minorities would live, and then, excuse me, people of color would live. And then guess what? They start removing social services from those areas, and then it just, this poverty cycle just continues to get deeper and deeper and deeper. So the red lines are invisible, but they're still sort of there today. And a really major impact of this has been the lack of wealth accumulation by people of color. And if you look at it, I think the number is the average black. Let me look at this real quick. That the white high school graduate in the U.S. has a median, the same median wealth as a black college graduate. And a lot of that has to do with, if you think about how people accumulate wealth over the generations, a lot of it has to do with owning a house. And when it becomes more, when it's more difficult to own a house, or you own a house in neighborhoods that are less desirable, you're not able to accumulate wealth. So the point is that race continues to play a role, and it's played a really strong historical role, but it's definitely still an issue, including things like sentencing. If you look up the average sentences for a black male and you look at a white male that commits the same crime, and there's research on this, you can see that the black males tend to receive longer sentencing. So it's still there. It's generally more subtle than it used to be, but it's certainly an issue. And lastly, with the Lifeboat Ethics reading, I found your feedback on that really interesting. Again, the idea here is that for it to be a social justice issue, the access to resources, so the people that are on the boat, the wealthy countries, the question is how do they get on that boat in terms of a justice issue? And most of us, like I'm on the boat, you're on the boat, if you're sitting here reading this in the United States, most likely you were just born on that boat. Now, I'm not saying that everybody in the U.S. is wealthy. Certainly not everybody that's listening to this is wealthy. But you generally have access to resources just by virtue of living and being born in the United States. And that's a really important justice issue. And I think a lot of you also pointed out that the boat, right? So the resources that we've used to develop in the United States and other Western countries in particular, we use a heck of a lot of resources, exploit a lot of resources from other countries, from people that are now in the water. And so, again, from a justice perspective, it's like, well, Hardman would just say, well, you're there already, and they're in the water, and you're in the boat, so what are you going to do? Okay, but it's I think fair to look at how the people in the water got in the water and how the people in the boat got in the boat and how they built their boat. And hopefully I don't have to get into, to tell you that we have a history of exploiting people and resources. I mean, look at the very foundation of the country. No way U.S. is what it is today without slavery. And so that's just one prominent example of that's actually rippled through the generations, and some of those folks are still kind of like swimming in the water. But certainly other countries, we are really good at going in and finding resources that we need and sort of exploiting them, and then they don't have as much access to them. Okay, so it is certainly a justice issue. I mean, you do have to be realistic about carrying capacity and how many people the Earth can support, but through a justice lens, it's really important to consider, how people ended up where they are. Okay, so that's the main thing. It's a really rich content area, so I'm certainly happy to point you in the direction of more resources. But all of these things are happening today. The social and environmental justice issues are happening all over the place. Neocolonialism is still certainly a thing. We have the legacy of redlining. You have people across the world that are suffering disproportionately because just by virtue of being born into a different country or a different race or religion or caste or whatever. So these are all issues that I think are important to be aware of, and you can make impacts Locally, there's all kinds of organizations that do support environmental and social justice initiatives, so that's something you can certainly get involved in. A couple of you mentioned that policies can be really important, and there's certainly, who you vote for and what their priorities are can change a lot of this on all scales, local, state, national. So if this is something you care about, it's certainly something you can make an impact on. Okay, that's it for the lesson 4 wrap up.